your morning so far?
Hectic, honestly. I had to do it. I was teaching a corporate innovation class for 2 hours already. So
wow, good job. Welcome.
Yeah. So thank you.
Nice. And I think we're live back from 3, 2, 1.
Fantastic.
It's not been so long. I think people will start getting sick of my face. But this is almost the middle of the road for the TechStars Startup Week, Next Generation. This is the 14th session. I did the unlucky number. I had the 13th session.
Wow! Yeah, congratulations. What perfect! But perfect timing for this year, for the past year, 2020, 2021. I think 13 we're going to change it. It's it's the lucky number. So.
I know. I mean, so many things have changed. And in the last session, I gave a small brief about how we came to work together and what you're up to. But
sure.
I'll just give you the floor for a couple of minutes for you to make your own introduction. I know you hate to introduce yourself, but who is Mark and what is this IAG thing? How come you're teaching entrepreneurship in multiple countries at the same time after the pandemic, especially?
Even before.
Even before, exactly. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what's the story?
Well, not my favorite topic, but as you said, no problem. I guess I'll go. I never know whether it's better to go backwards or forwards, so I'll go backwards and say, I teach innovation and entrepreneurship. So I teach entrepreneurship to startups, but I also teach innovation within large corporations. And I have a faculty position at the University of California in Berkeley. And I also help to create an independent educational organization called the Innovation Acceleration Group. And when you see IAG associated with me and frankly, sometimes with you, Ozan, IAG is the Innovation Acceleration Group. And those words for my organization, for our organization, were chosen very carefully because innovation meaning not only entrepreneurship, but also starting and building new things inside companies and inside governments. Acceleration meaning not innovation creation group, innovation acceleration group, because we don't presume to tell you how to be creative. Creativity is something that people have because they encounter problems in the world they want to solve or because they get excited. But creativity, we're not trying to be psychologists and help you think differently. We're trying to help you accelerate. And the group, because nobody succeeds alone, right? There is no such thing as success alone. Every single successful person is part of a group and a team, and you don't succeed alone. So that's what I do now. Very quickly, how I landed here. I spent 20 years running startups before I started teaching. I should mention my faculty position at Berkeley is in the College of Engineering. And I used to be in the business school, and that's relevant to some of what we'll talk about in terms of education and disruption. And before I started teaching, I was a practitioner in industry. I worked in 8 different startups over 20 years with every possible outcome from IPOs to crashes. And before that, I was a management consultant at Deloitte, which might sound familiar to you. And before that, I did an MBA at the Harvard Business School. And before that, I worked in manufacturing. And I've been alive a long time. So I will say that there was one time in my life when I was a full-time athlete. So when I was a full-time internationally competitive athlete. So I'll leave that for someone to research on the internet if they want. So
that's like the ungoogleable facts about Mark.
That's right, undiscoverable.
Undiscoverable, exactly. So I mean, you have multiple parts in your career, from corporate to management consultants. To running startups and now teaching entrepreneurship. And we were just in the session that I finished before this.
Right.
I was talking about in the last 20 years how the entrepreneurship education caught up with entrepreneurs. More like usually it's there's research and entrepreneurs take the research and do something with it, especially in engineering. But this time, in the entrepreneurship ecosystem in general, the academics did not do the research on entrepreneurship, so people took away from it, But entrepreneurs did whatever they did, and then academics went back and say, hey, wait a second, can we build a theory around this? Is this something that we can build a pattern? Is this something like we can take from the existing and anecdotes and examples of Silicon Valley especially, and then build something replicable? And that's actually probably why entrepreneurship teaching doesn't get the credit it requires, or people don't actually believe or still hesitate if entrepreneurship can be taught or should be taught.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say. How much time do we have?
As much time we need.
Yeah. So let me start by highlighting a couple of really key points and building on some of what you said. And I will make every effort to be brief, but there is a lot that we could say about this. And obviously, I look forward to engagement with this audience beyond just today's session. But first of all, let me say this. When in the title of this 30-minute session inside, Techstars Startup Week Istanbul, we said, it's disruption in education technology and honoring Clayton Christensen. And I just want to focus very briefly on Professor Christensen because so when people say, what's the most famous business school in the world? Not necessarily the best, I would argue great, and a lot of times people will say Harvard Business School. Now, that's self-serving for me because I have an MBA from Harvard Business School, but I arrived at Harvard Business School the same year, as a student, the same year that Clayton Christensen arrived as a faculty member. So he arrived as a professor in the same year, and that year was 1992. And there's a couple of things to say that when I tell people, they literally don't believe me. And that is that at that time, there was no entrepreneurship center in the Harvard Business School. There was no such thing as an entrepreneurship center. Now, there was a course called Entrepreneurial Finance.
Yeah.
Now, the course used to have a different name, and no one would sign up. The signing was declining because it had a name like, financial planning or something, and nobody cared. And the professor, whose name was William Salmon, he wasn't Clayton because Professor Christensen wasn't there yet. He said, if I call it entrepreneurial finance, everybody signs up. So he made that shift. So he identified something in the audience, which was the students, which was, they want the word entrepreneurial, but the school had no idea. So Professor Christensen arrives, and more or less 3 or 4 years later, he publishes The Innovator's Dilemma. And it's crazy, Ozan, when we think about it. Today, it's 2021. And we are still talking about this book that was written in 1997. It was a totally different world. So why is that? Why was Clayton Christensen a professor who's been called like the most influential business thinker of the 21st century, the theory of disruption and characterizing disruptive innovation as a way for entrepreneurial ventures to conquer entire markets, to really redefine markets and crush 100-year-old, well-established companies that seem like they're, so how does that happen? Well, what he did and who he was really fundamental to changing the way we think about entrepreneurship and therefore how to teach it. And that is, he himself had been an entrepreneur. So his job immediately, he did get a PhD, but before getting, which I have never done, but before getting his PhD, he created as co-founder and ran as president his own company. Yep. Most of the professors inside the Harvard Business School in the 1990s when I arrived had no industry experience. If they had experience, it was as a consultant, not as an operating manager in a company. And they thought they knew everything, but it was very academic. And then what happened with what Christensen really ushered in, not only with the book, but with who he was he ushered in this idea that we can marry real world experience of building businesses with analysis and characterizing frameworks and characterizing, I like the word frameworks rather than, methodologies or whatever. I just really like that word. So there's a frame within which we can place pieces. And that's what he did with the Innovator's Dilemma, with the theory of disruptive innovation, and then reapply that more broadly. So we take a specific example from our own life. we generalize it, and then we apply it out in the world. And now we've revolutionized education. So you said people don't believe it. I will tell you my lived experience. So I've been teaching innovation and entrepreneurship now since 1990, or excuse me, since 2000. I've got the 90s in my mind, since 2014. So from 1994, more or less, when I left Deloitte after finishing my MBA and going into Deloitte, until 2014, more or less. So all of those 20 years, I was working in startups. But now since 2014, I've been teaching. And when I used to, before March of 2020, when we all locked down, I used to travel a lot on planes. And I would sit down, and sometimes if the person next to me was a chatty, extroverted person, they would say, oh, what do you do? And I say, I teach entrepreneurship. 50% of the time, people would say entrepreneurship cannot be taught, right? They cannot be taught. So what is it that that Christensen and everybody who's followed him, including myself, and I think including you, has done, is to say, well, actually, we take what we've learned in industry and what we've observed from creating businesses, and we generalize it into a framework. And we don't teach people how to have a good idea. We teach people how to implement, execute, evaluate, and most importantly, pivot and find the opportunities based on their big idea. And that ends up being what we teach. And that ends up in itself being an innovation about teaching innovation. So how do we teach innovation? Well, we've innovated it by drawing on not just a case study method where we study what happened 20 years ago or 50 years ago, but a real-time method where we say, what's the startup idea you're working on today? Now let's apply the framework, and now let's make decisions about your startup. I don't know. That's a long answer. I said I have a lot to say, and I don't want to fill the whole time. But
no, I mean it's perfect because well, after Christensen, a lot of people came up with the frameworks and everything else, like crossing the chasm, building great companies, and then recently we were just discussing it in the previous session. The business model Canvas, like every accelerator, incubator, every startup uses, is a PhD thesis.
Right.
It's not like Alexander Osterwald invented the business model or build a canvas around the business model. I just put that framework into something applicable. Same with Eric Ries. He was in the business school, learning, getting his classes from Steve Blank, who was an entrepreneur himself, who wrote the first book, which is very hard to read if you're not a geek in
the Epiphany, that book.
The Epiphany is like a really tough one to consume if you're not an entrepreneur. It's very hard to grasp. Right. But then he built the startup book, and then he was the master for Eric Ries, who led the lean innovation back into our lives, or lean startup into the application side. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the last, let's say, 10 years as well. And do you think that is? I mean, it's in general, it's a good thing that universities are leading this, but at the same time, is the industry or are the entrepreneurs really using those, or are they still the ones who say, "Well, I'll figure it myself. I don't need any books"? Is it skepticism only through the education part of it, or are people still like going through, oh, I will be an entrepreneur no matter what, and I don't need to read anything, I'll just go and do it, I'll just go and sell it?
Well, again, I mean, Ozan, you've known me long enough to know I have strong opinions about everything, and one of the things that I hate is willful ignorance. And I'm gonna say that I'm gonna quote a wise but not very nice man, and I'm not going to tell you who he is, but a wise but not very nice man once said to me, you use every tool available to you. You don't use the tools that are not available. Like, you can't steal somebody else's idea. That's not available to you. That's unethical. But you use every tool that is available. So if you're going to be an entrepreneur and you're going to go and try to create something new in the world, for whatever reason motivates you, if you don't use every tool that's available to you, you're being stupid and you're being willfully ignorant. And so I think that, entrepreneurship, education, it's funny. I have become an entrepreneur now, an educator in entrepreneurship. But when I was studying myself, I never thought I would start my own company. That sounded way too risky. That sounded way too scary to me. So there's a way in which, people who embrace the idea of creating something new inherently bring some courage and some motivation. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. But if you decide willfully to say, I don't need help, and I don't mean going and getting a degree. Going and getting a degree is a choice. Going and getting information, if you don't, then I have a hard time thinking, that you're on a good path, because information and knowledge is always helpful, and it saves you time. So I think there are people. I have had the experience, by the way, of having entrepreneurs come into a program I'm teaching and say, well, I only signed up for your program. This is a true story. I had a guy in Brazil, and he said, like on day 2 of our entrepreneurship training program through his university, he said, I want you to know I only signed up because my organization I'm trying to get to help my startup required me to come. By the end of that session, which was 2 months, it was 8 weeks program, he said, this is the most important program that has made all the difference for my startup. And he's become he's quoted on videos about our Innovation Acceleration Group, IAG programs. I talked to him a few months back, and he and I worked together in 2017. So he had been exercising willful ignorance ahead of time. Then he embraced, more or less because he was forced by an outside agency, and now he changed his idea. But what he was getting at in his rejection was a lot of people do a really shitty job of teaching entrepreneurship, and it's possible to go and think you're going to make yourself better and gain nothing from entrepreneurship education. And that makes me angry, because that means people are out there, not doing a good job in their education. I do want to do one thing, Ozan, which is I happen to look over on my right and I see there's a couple questions. I'm just going to answer them quickly. Somebody has said,
yes.
Do you think the use of technology in education will offer us the right learning model? And the second question is, do you think face-to-face education will continue to be important in the future, or will online education gain importance? And I'm going to do 2 things to answer both of those questions. One is I'm going to parse a word, which is EdTech. We talk about EdTech, education technology. And what I want to encourage everybody who's listening to think about is what we mean by technology. And what I mean by that is to say, we talk today about EdTech as a category, but it's a bullshit category. It basically is just education. We call it EdTech. And we have this other thing that we call FinTech, which is financial technology. Well, guess what? Many years ago, the spreadsheet was financial technology. And now we just think of it as, yeah, of course we use spreadsheets, and there's these other things. So when we adopt technologies, I mean, the early before spreadsheets, the financial technology was pre-printing a sheet of paper with the ledger on it, with that was financial technology. It's the same with education. Ed technology is like, early education technology is a blackboard. And then we have a new technology that's called a whiteboard. And now we have new technologies that are distance learning. So I don't want to minimize the technology. All I want to say is, look, ed technology is education. And we are always going to use more and more technology in education. Now, I'm going to go beyond the sort of just video conferencing and talk about distance learning. So distance learning is easy to use. Distance learning is a huge game changer. And people focus only on the effect on the students being able to study anytime or learn the material anytime at their convenience and all that. But you're missing the other side of the equation, which is the teachers. And the reason that distance learning can become powerful, and has, and I think will, and the pandemic just accelerated all this, right? It accelerated this inherent disruption, which is the idea that we can learn at a distance. The thing that we embraced, and you remember this, Ozan, because when you and I you remember in 2014 that you were in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I hope I'm not disclosing something private. and we were training entrepreneurs, and I was in Berkeley. Now, we came together face-to-face to start the program. Then I went back to California, and we had weekly class meetings online. Now, think about that. The weekly class meetings, it's helping the students. That's the live. You can do it asynchronously. There's a question about courses like Udemy and all of the online video courses. That's great. You can do it asynchronously. So that's great. But what you're missing when you focus on the students is the teachers. So I teach for a reason. I teach because I care to have the impact on my students. Just in the last 2 months, I have been teaching in all over the world from this table, from the table where I'm sitting in my home in Berkeley. And I can impact, Indian high school students, Brazilian corporate innovators, European entrepreneurs, all of these people. And by extending my reach, by using this distance learning technology, it's a classic case of disruptive technology. The experience, I think we can all agree, is worse. It is a worse solution than face-to-face for everybody. It's worse for me. It's worse for you. I can't see my students right now listening to me, on this. I have no idea how many are in the audience. It's like there's lots of things that are bad about this experience, but it adds something new, which is I can teach around the world, and everybody in the world can have access to, I won't say myself, but to experts, right? You can get any expert and that changes the game, because what it means is we're no longer restricted to the teachers we can meet. We can, and the question was specifically, will face-to-face education continue to be important? And the answer is yes, I think it will, because it's strictly better in certain ways. Like, we have that human interaction. But the idea that distance learning will somehow disappear is crazy. So we are always now, for the next foreseeable future, going to have both. And it's the coexistence of these three things, which are previously recorded educational content, whether it's about entrepreneurship or other things, that will be available, and you'll have access to the world's leading experts. The second thing is what we're doing now, which is live, but also recorded for later viewing, interaction with an expert or a purported expert. And then the third thing is face-to-face. And we will always, I think, have all three, and they will find the role to play. It's a little bit like, video didn't replace radio. It just changed what radio was going to be, or audio. So anyway, I just saw the question, so I wanted to make sure I addressed those. Yeah.
I mean, there's one thing that I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, we chat regularly, and we build things regularly. And I think what you mentioned about the experts, the real people, I think, as you mentioned, the students now have multiple options, but the teachers, instructors will start having less and less options if they do not do their jobs well. Because I think what is going to happen is, if you really don't know much about what you're teaching, but you are assigned to teach one class and students come in, and somebody is paying you to teach in X university, doesn't matter which one, and you could be doing a not so good job, that is no longer option.
Right.
Because if I am making things, if most respected, and it's not about an institution. I mean, there could be shitty instructors in the best institutions. There could be really good instructors.
I can confirm that is true.
It's now, I think it's becoming more, I hate to use the word, but it's actually literally democratizing and building a meritocratic understanding of what instruction, what the quality instruction means. Because I don't know who will do this, but as we move forward, the degrees will lose, the institutions who are granting the degrees will lose their importance, but the degree itself will be a hybrid. So they can say, hey, I'm a business graduate. Oh, where did you learn business graduate? Well, I learned this context from this professor in this university, this topic from this university, this professor, and I had all these great people who are not really easy to put under one roof. I mean, you lived in Spain, in Barcelona. It's like there will be a Barcelona team built up for me, for my career, for my knowledge expertise, but you will not have the institution who will bring all the great players in one field into one institution, because it's no longer necessary. They'll say, hey, we really got the best instructors in marketing and this. Come and sign up to this instructors.
Yeah.
And then we'll give you a credit. And whatever you do with the credit is pointless. Nobody will be asking for degrees. It was like, oh, you really learned from market entrepreneurship, or you really learned from this person. And oh, those are great people. I'm very happy that you learned this. And nobody will give, I mean, this is going to take time, especially with like hundreds of years old institutions like Harvard and Stanford and Berkeley and everything else. But the rest of the world will no longer strive to become the best institution. They'll just try to become the best, quote unquote, placeholder for these instructors. Right. That is liberating to instructors if it happens, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when you think about what's the purpose of a university and one of the many purposes of the university is it's this aggregation point of expertise. Like we can bring all these experts in different fields to one place, then we aggregate, the students, right? So we aggregate the professor community, we aggregate the student community, we bring them together. The students cycle through, the professors stay until they retire, and all those things, right? And that's sort of the aggregation point. And now I think the next phase, or maybe the phase after the next phase, is going to be this notion of aggregation online, right? So the aggregation is not we all go physically to this set of land in Cambridge or in Allston, Massachusetts, which is the Harvard Business School, or we go to this piece of land in Berkeley, California, but rather that university has to virtualize itself and say, well, actually what we are is an aggregation, but it's a digital aggregation of expertise, and we're going to bring students to benefit from that expertise, and then utilize that to their benefit. And I do think you use the word democratizing. I do think that you get this effect that, when you think about how we use the internet in commerce, there's a really big, and particularly, when you get into newer applications like Airbnb and Uber and these things, there's this notion of rating and impact. It's like, yeah, this one had a good impact on me, so I'm giving it lots of stars. And I think that, and I hope that, and again, now I will express my arrogant belief that I think I'm good at this, and I think I can be helpful, and I know I need to get better. Both of those things can be true. I hope that it's in a way it's a shame for the people who are doing a lousy job of teaching entrepreneurship or any other subject that they won't have a future doing it. But in a way, that's better for the overall world, because then we get to have people benefiting from the best teachers and then taking that forward and having the most impact. And I do think that you raised something else, which is this, and it ties directly into a comment from, I think it's Didam, which is, you have this notion of the degree. You come, you study for 4 years, then you're done and finished, and then you just have a career. This notion that, the world's always changing. We have to be continuously learning. And that is actually how I backed into the university. I started teaching entrepreneurship actually just outside in the world, being brought in by entrepreneurial communities to talk about my experience and what I learned from my experience. And then I got hired into the university because, as we said, like in the case of Clayton Christensen, the university beginning to see value in that experience in some ways even more than the PhD and the academic experience. So I think I'm talking so much, we're running out of time already.
No, I mean, we have a few more minutes.
Okay.
There was a conversation we were having, and I think I might have said, which quite frankly I believe, when you start entrepreneurship education after high school in university grades, it's super late, and universities are doing a freaking poor job in investing in student entrepreneurs and teaching entrepreneurship, because most of the academics don't actually have any sector experience. So, but having said that, I am more hopeful to see high schools taking more responsibility in giving younger kids, younger people, a take on entrepreneurship, either a startup week or a hackathon or a competition, or what I'm trying to build with Sage is more like entrepreneurial awareness and what is entrepreneurship, what is innovation, what's invention, how the world works about entrepreneurship. Am I naive to think high schools will play a more robust role or more impactful role in entrepreneurship, or should we just leave it to the time where the kids are old enough to make their own payments and worry about their own future? Like, is this something that schools should invest in, or just wait until they finish their grades and get their SATs or whatever?
Well, I mean, so again, I'll try to be brief. My short answer is I think it's a natural progression and a good progression to drive entrepreneurial education into the high schools. As it turns out, I'm helping you a little bit, with Sage for entrepreneurial education. I'm working on another project with entrepreneurial education in Asia for high schoolers. Why would I do that? Well, I'm doing that. Why do I do it, and why do I think it's important? I'm doing it because I think, there's been a progression through time. One was, well, yeah, sure, entrepreneurship, starting a new business, you do that after you've graduated. First, you gain all this knowledge, then you go and you create something after you have the knowledge. Like first you get a undergraduate degree, then you get a master's in business, then you become an entrepreneur, or a master's in engineering or something. Well, now we've already pushed it back to where undergraduate university students are studying how to create new businesses. Why is that? Well, I heard I had to drop off early, but I heard part of your session, prior to this. And it's because that's how to control your own future. That's how to guarantee, there are no guarantees in life, but that's how to increase the likelihood of a career and a job is create it yourself, right? Create it yourself and create jobs for others. So that's going to be motivating to the individuals as students. So what happens next? Well, those individuals as students, at some point they graduate and they get married and they have kids. And now these kids are coming up behind this generation. If you think about the entrepreneurial wave and the fragmentation of employment from a few huge employers to many, many small employers and the creation of all these businesses, which is just a trend that's frankly growing and accelerating through time. People who have seen that and been a part of that are now having kids, and those kids are now going to university and now they're coming into high school. And those parents see a high school education has two customers. There's the students, but there's also the parents, just because the students are still so young. And it's when the parents are valuing the knowledge that is involved in entrepreneurship, that's involved in creating and controlling your own future, instead of being at the mercy of forces beyond your control. But creating and controlling your own future, parents want that for their children. Children in high school are learning the value by, they're super attentive, right? They pay a lot of attention to the world. And as they see that, so I think it's actually not only the natural next step, but a critical step, and I'm going to go big for society and for the future of the world, that we should actually take these concepts and introduce them as soon as students are able to understand and process them, as soon as they have the foundational work that comes in lower school and middle school. And therefore, I actually think the second half of high school, 11th grade, 12th grade years, are ideally the right time to bring entrepreneurship in. And some people will realize that they don't want to be entrepreneurs, but other people will realize this is exactly what I want for creating and controlling my own future. And I think if we don't embrace that and frankly help lead that, then we're not doing our full service to our society. So is that a big enough statement for you?
That is perfect. And
I agree with you on that.
One of the things that I keep telling students who hesitate in engaging with entrepreneurship is like, and one of the main reasons for some of them is like, oh, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be an architect. Why the hell do I need entrepreneurship, or do I need to know this? And you're like, well, what do doctors use these days? What do architects use these? What do lawyers use these days? Are built by entrepreneurs.
Right.
If you are a doctor, what you are actually learning to utilize as tools is not built by doctors, it's built by engineers.
Right.
If you're going to be really good
Yeah,
at
that's my point about EdTech, MedTech. Medical technology isn't tech, isn't MedTech, it's medicine. We have a name for that. It's the practice of medicine. The practice of the use of EdTech is the practice of education. So the intersection of entrepreneurial introduced technologies is the practice of all these professions. I completely agree.
And some of them was like, oh, okay, I'll use tools and find there are some entrepreneurs doing this. And what about lawyers? And they go like, well, have you heard about artificial intelligence? Like, you guys will not be reading stuff anymore. Somebody else will tell you from the right of your ear saying, oh, in 1992, this case was a similar 97% of this case matches with this, who concluded with this. And this is not an information that you by yourself can have expertise in, and that is going to be developed by an entrepreneur. So, and I think once the kids have that understanding, once like whatever they use on their phones is almost 100% built by entrepreneurs who did not even exist 20 years ago in terms of companies or individuals, they go like, now I understand. I have to know about this, whether I build a company or I become a social entrepreneur, which is another angle to it, is completely irrelevant. Like you can build many things as long as you have the right framework and to take your favorite word to it. So perfect. Last couple of minutes, what would be your final words? I kind of dropped the bomb on you, but
yeah, I mean, I think I'm just gonna try to, bundle this up into, a couple of key statements, and that is that, I think that, we should look beyond the idea of, our use of technology. That's just what we call life now, and we can talk about, and similarly, the role of entrepreneurship is really, to me, just the role of business. And entrepreneurship, again, as defined by, the guy, by Clayton Christensen, this idea of disruption. So creating new things, creating our own future, that's entrepreneurship. I think training, using every tool available, to roll that quote back, which means using the available technologies, and then using those in a way to accelerate, positive outcomes for ourselves and our communities. I mean, I think that's the part that gets disconnected, is like, let's focus on creating good that comes from having people who are educated and familiar with every tool available to create value, and then using those. And just to round it out, entrepreneurship isn't important education only for the entrepreneurs themselves. It's important for everybody, because that's how our society is going forward, to create in a more and more fragmented world as individuals, but connected through the internet and all the other means of connecting virtually. That's how we're going to live our lives going forward. So educating people on the principles of entrepreneurship is really educating people on creating and controlling their own future, in my opinion. So
perfect. Got nothing to add to it. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, nice to see you guys. Have a good night in Istanbul. It's still morning. Yeah. It's almost lunchtime here in California. So
yeah, enjoy the rest of the day. Have a good rest of your week. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for including me.
Bye.